November 18th, 1944. 4:27 hours. Bougainville Island. Corporal James Jimmy Mitchell, 23 years old, Massachusetts native, lies in a hastily dug foxhole on Hill 260, watching the jungle tree line 200 yards downslope. His hands shake, not from fear, though there's plenty of that, but from the weight of what sits beside him. A modified Browning automatic rifle, M1918A2. Except this one has something different, something the brass swore would change everything. The pre-dawn darkness carries sounds, rustling, movement, the kind that makes your stomach knot because you know what's coming. Mitchell's unit, Baker Company, 3rd Marine Division, has held this position for 6 days. Every night, the Japanese come. Every night, his bar runs dry at the worst possible moment. 20 rounds. That's all the magazine holds. 20 rounds against wave attacks of 50, 60, sometimes 100 men screaming up the slope. But tonight's different. Tonight, his bar has a modified feed system. Tonight, every 5th round isn't a standard .30-06 cartridge. Tonight, every 5th round carries an M2 explosive primer, the same charge used in 40mm grenades, crimped into a specially reinforced case. The rustling stops. Mitchell's finger finds the trigger. His squad leader, Sergeant Davis, is 3 foxholes over. They've practiced this. They know the theory. But theory and a nighttime banzai charge are different things entirely. Then the screaming starts. By November 1944, the Pacific War had revealed a critical problem with American infantry firepower. The Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, was the squad's primary automatic weapon. Designed by John Moses Browning in 1917, adopted in 1918, it fired the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge. At 19.4 pounds loaded, it delivered devastating firepower. But it had one fatal flaw in Pacific combat: magazine capacity. 20 rounds. That's what the standard BAR magazine held. 20 rounds in a weapon designed to provide sustained suppressive fire. 20 rounds when Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized overwhelming night assaults with numerical superiority. On Guadalcanal in 1942, on Tarawa in 1943, on Saipan and Peleliu in 1944, American units reported the same problem. BAR gunners would fire their magazines empty in 4-second bursts, then fumble for replacements while enemy soldiers closed the distance. The statistics were sobering. On Tarawa, November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division suffered 3,407 casualties in 76 hours. After-action reports cited BAR magazine changes as a critical vulnerability during Japanese counterattacks. At Peleliu, September 1944, the 1st Marine Division recorded 57 instances where BAR gunners were killed or wounded during magazine changes. The weapon's cyclic rate of 500-650 rounds per minute meant a 20-round magazine lasted 2.4 seconds of continuous fire. The Marines needed sustained firepower. They needed something that could break up mass charges without leaving gunners vulnerable during reloads. But increasing magazine capacity wasn't simple. The BAR's bottom-loading magazine design was integral to the weapon. Larger magazines would be heavier, more prone to feed failures in jungle conditions, and incompatible with prone firing positions. The solution came from an unexpected source. In July 1944, Captain Theodore Walsh, Ordnance Corps, stationed at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, was reviewing declassified German weapons research. The Germans had experimented with explosive ammunition for aircraft weapons, rounds that detonated on impact or near miss, to increase effectiveness against bombers. Walsh saw something different. What if you could make standard ammunition do more damage without changing the basic cartridge? He requisitioned 500 M2 explosive primers, typically used in 14mm grenade launchers, and a workshop at Aberdeen. The M2 primer contained 96 milligrams of RDX explosive, enough to detonate the main charge in a 40mm projectile. Walsh theorized that crimping these primers into reinforced .3006 cartridge cases would create rounds that exploded on impact, multiplying the bar's effectiveness without requiring new weapons or training. The initial tests on August 3, 1944, were promising. Standard .3006 armor-piercing rounds penetrated ballistic gelatin targets with minimal cavitation. The explosive primer rounds created cavitation channels 4 times larger, with secondary fragmentation effects. More importantly, when fired at wooden barriers simulating jungle vegetation, the explosive rounds cleared significantly more foliage. But there was a problem. The explosive primers generated 18% more chamber pressure than standard rounds. Firing them continuously risked barrel failure. Walsh's solution was elegant. Load them every 5th round. 4 standard rounds to maintain reliable feeding and manageable recoil, 1 explosive round to multiply effect. The pattern created a predictable rhythm. Suppressive fire with standard rounds, devastating impact with explosive rounds, all from the same magazine. By September 15, 1944, Aberdeen had produced 50,000 modified cartridges, designated .3006 M2 high explosive. The cartridge cases were reinforced at the base, marked with a single red band for identification. The Ordnance Department classified the project secret and assigned it to Com-Spec WEPACs, Commander, Special Weapons, Pacific, a little-known logistics command responsible for evaluating experimental ordnance in combat conditions. The first shipment reached Guadalcanal on October 8, 1944. 6,000 rounds. Enough to equip 1 company of Marines with modified bar loads for field testing. Baker Company, 3rd Marine Division, was selected. They were heading to Bougainville, where Japanese forces still held significant territory, and night attacks were constant. The Marines called them hot rounds, or snappers, because of the distinctive crack they made on impact. The official designation was too cumbersome for combat use. What they didn't know was what the Japanese would call them. If you want to see how these experimental rounds performed in actual combat and why they were immediately classified after the war, hit that like button and subscribe. This story stayed buried in classified files for 35 years, and you're about to find out why. Back to Jimmy Mitchell. The .3006 M2 high explosive round looked almost identical to standard ammunition. Length 3.34 inches. Case diameter 473 inches. Projectile weight 150 grains, the same as M2 armor-piercing rounds. The only visible difference was the red band painted around the cartridge case, 1/4 inch from the base. Inside, the differences were substantial. The cartridge case was manufactured from manganese bronze alloy instead of standard brass, giving it 40% greater tensile strength to handle the explosive primer's pressure spike. The case wall thickness at the base measured .025 inches versus .018 inches for standard cases. This reinforcement added 12 grains to the total cartridge weight, barely noticeable when loaded in a magazine. The M2 explosive primer sat in a specially machined primer pocket, deeper than standard, to accommodate the primer's greater length. The primer contained 96 milligrams of RDX explosive, cyclotrimethylnitrinitramine, the same compound used in composition C3 plastic explosive. This was significantly more energetic than the standard Boxer primer's 4 milligrams of lead styphnate. When the firing pin struck the primer, The RDX detonated with approximately 18,400 feet per second brisance, the shattering effect of an explosive. This detonation served two functions. First, it ignited the 47 grains of IMR 4895 propellant powder, driving the projectile down the barrel at 2,700 feet per second. Second, it transmitted a shock wave through the propellant, ensuring more complete combustion and thus higher muzzle velocity. The projectile itself was modified. The standard M2 armor-piercing round had a hardened steel core. The M2HE round used a mild steel core surrounded by a copper jacket, with the forward section containing a small cavity filled with 8 grains of additional RDX. Upon impact, the deceleration force triggered this charge, causing the projectile to fragment into 15 to 20 pieces rather than remaining intact. Think of it this way. A standard 30-06 round is like a nail driven through wood. It makes a hole. The M2HE round is like a small firecracker that goes off after it punches through. It makes a hole, then explodes inside, creating multiple wound channels and clearing vegetation in a small radius. The pressure spike from the explosive primer was the critical engineering challenge. Peak chamber pressure in a standard .3006 firing measures approximately 50,000 psi. The M2HE round generated 58,000 psi. This was within the bar's design tolerance of 65,000 psi, but prolonged firing could accelerate barrel wear. Aberdeen's testing showed that firing M2HE rounds continuously could reduce barrel life from 10,000 rounds to 6,500 rounds. The 5-round spacing solved this. 4 standard rounds at 50,000 psi, 1 M2HE at 58,000 psi, averaging 51,600 psi over 5 rounds, well within safe operating parameters. The spacing also helped with recoil management. The M2HE round produced 22% more recoil energy than standard ammunition. Firing them continuously would make the bar nearly uncontrollable in automatic fire. The 4-round spacing meant the shooter could anticipate the harder kicking round and maintain aim. The ammunition was packaged in standard 20-round bar magazines, preloaded at Aberdeen with the correct spacing. Each magazine contained 16 standard M2 ball rounds and 4 M2HE rounds in the 5th, 10th, 15th, and 20th positions. The magazines were marked with yellow tape on the base plate for identification. Sergeants in Baker Company received the shipment on November 12, 1944, at their staging area on Bougainville. They were given minimal instruction. Load these magazines, fire normally, expect slightly increased muzzle flash, and report. The classification meant they couldn't discuss the ammunition with anyone outside their unit. They didn't know what the rounds would do beyond increased effect on target. Jimmy Mitchell got his first yellow-taped magazine on November 13th. He loaded it into his bar in the armory tent, ejected it, loaded it again. The rounds looked normal, except for the red bands. They felt normal. The magazine weight was identical to standard loads. He asked Sergeant Davis what made them special. Davis shrugged. Guess we'll find out when we shoot somebody with them. 5 days later, they found out. 4:28 hours, November 18th, 1944. Mitchell sees them now, shadows becoming shapes. The Japanese are using their standard approach, loose formation, moving through the jungle, using every bit of cover, trying to get within grenade range before the final rush. He counts 8, 12, 20. They keep coming. His bar is set to automatic. Selector switch all the way forward. Bipod legs deployed. The weapon angles down the slope, tracking the movement 180 yards out. Sergeant Davis doesn't give an order. Doesn't need to. Every Marine on the line knows the drill. Wait until they're close enough that you can't miss. Wait until they commit to the charge. Then break them. 150 yards. The shapes are clearly men now, moving faster. The rustling becomes crashing. Someone yells in Japanese. 125 yards. Mitchell's finger tightens on the trigger. The bar's forestock is slick with morning condensation. His breathing steadies. He picks a target. Leading man. Moving straight up the trail. 100 yards. The Japanese scream. It's not a war cry. It's a signal. The scattered formation converges into a massed charge. 40 men, maybe 50, screaming and running uphill directly at Baker Company's position. Mitchell fires. The bar hammers. 4 rounds punch out in a 3-second burst. Standard M2 ball. He sees impacts on the leading man's torso. The soldier goes down. Mitchell adjusts left. Fires again. 4 more rounds. Then the 5th. The M2. HE round hits a Japanese soldier center mass at 95 yards. The impact looks different. There's a flash. Small, orange, barely visible in pre-dawn light. The soldier doesn't just fall. He's thrown backward, arms spread, as if punched by an invisible fist. The men on either side of him flinch, stumble. One goes down, with fragmentation wounds. Mitchell doesn't have time to process this. He's firing. The bar cycles. 4 standard rounds into the mass of charging infantry. Then another M2HE. This one hits a soldier in the shoulder. The flash is brighter. The soldier's arm separates. 2 men behind him scream. The charge hesitates, wavers. These are experienced Japanese infantrymen. They've faced bar fire before. They know the sound, the rhythm, the pattern. This is different. Their men aren't just falling. They're being torn apart. The spacing of the explosive rounds is random from their perspective. Every few seconds, someone detonates. Mitchell's magazine runs dry at 4:29 hours. He's fired 20 rounds in approximately 8 seconds. He drops the empty magazine, reaches for a fresh one, yellow tape on the base plate, slams it home, charges the weapon, resumes firing. The entire Marine line is shooting now. Rifle fire, grenades, mortars landing in the jungle behind the Japanese formation. But Mitchell can see his rounds working. Each M2HE impact creates a small clear space. Vegetation shreds. Men fall in groups rather than individually. His second magazine empties. He reloads. The Japanese charge has broken. They're falling back, dragging wounded, leaving bodies. He fires into the retreating formation. Controlled bursts. 4 rounds. 5th round impacts a tree trunk. The explosive charge detonates, showering bark and splinters. 2 Japanese soldiers stumble, faces bloodied. By 4:32 hours, the attack is over. 4 minutes from first shot to silence. Mitchell's hands shake violently now. Adrenaline dump. He's fired 3 magazines. 60 rounds total. 12 of them were M2HE. He looks downslope. The results are visible even in poor light. Bodies lie in small craters. Vegetation is cleared in spots, as if something exploded, which it did. The visual effect is disproportionate to the actual explosive force, but in the chaos of night combat, it looks devastating. Sergeant Davis moves along the line. Anybody hit? Nobody. Baker Company took no casualties. In previous attacks on Hill 260, they'd averaged 3 wounded per engagement. This time, 0. Davis stops at Mitchell's foxhole, looks at the empty magazines, looks downslope, looks at Mitchell. What the hell was in those rounds? Mitchell doesn't know, but he knows it worked. At 6:30 hours after dawn, a patrol moves downslope to assess enemy casualties and collect intelligence. They count 23 Japanese dead. But the wounds are strange. Entry wounds show massive cavitation. Several bodies show fragmentation damage, inconsistent with grenade or mortar fire. One soldier's rifle is bent, the wooden stock shattered, as if something exploded next to it. The patrol's corpsman, Navy hospitalman, Second Class Robert Chen, examines the bodies. He's seen thousands of gunshot wounds. These are different. He finds copper jacket fragments and small amounts of explosive residue. He reports this to the company commander, Captain William Hayes. Hayes forwards the report up the chain. By 14 hours, an ordnance officer from Com-Spec-Weepak arrives via observation plane. He examines the battlefield. He examines Mitchell's bar. Barrel shows accelerated wear, but remains serviceable. He collects the empty magazines. He confiscates Chen's report and classifies it secret. He tells Captain Hayes to continue using the ammunition and submit daily reports. He tells the men to tell nobody outside the unit. He flies back to Guadalcanal. What Hayes doesn't know, what nobody in Baker Company knows, is that 40 miles west, a captured Japanese soldier is being interrogated. He's from a unit that attacked American positions near Cape Torokina 2 days prior. He describes a new American weapon. He doesn't know what it is, but his unit has a name for it: Kaminari-jū, Thunder Rifle. The Americans translate it as Thunder Beast. By November 25, 1944, Baker Company had expended 4,200 of their $6,000 in M2HE rounds. Their combat reports documented 17 engagements involving the modified ammunition. Enemy casualties in these engagements totaled 147, confirmed dead versus 32 confirmed dead in engagements using standard ammunition. More significantly, American casualties dropped. Pre-M2HE, Baker Company averaged 2.3 casualties per engagement. Post-M2HE, 0.8 casualties per engagement. The statistics convinced Com-Spec-Weepak. On December 2, 1944, they requested immediate production of 500,000 rounds from Aberdeen Proving Ground. They also requested expansion of the program to include .3006 ammunition for the M1 Garand rifle, though this proved technically unfeasible due to the Garand's gas-operated system being sensitive to pressure spikes. Aberdeen responded that maximum production capacity was 50,000 rounds per month. The manganese bronze cases required specialized manufacturing. The RDX filling process was labor-intensive. The Army couldn't produce enough to supply standard infantry units across the Pacific Theater, but they could supply specialist units. Between December 1944 and August 1945, M2HE ammunition was issued to approximately 2,400 Marines in specialized defensive and raiding roles. This included 3 companies of the 3rd Marine Division on Bougainville, 840 rounds per company, 2 companies of the 1st Marine Division on Kaminari-jū, 840 rounds per company, 4 Marine Raider battalions conducting operations in the Philippines, 200 rounds per battalion, selected perimeter defense units on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, variable amounts. The ammunition never received an official nickname. Hot rounds and snappers were common. Thunder rounds emerged after Japanese prisoners used the term Kaminari-jū. But within the small community of Marines who used them, they were simply red bands, after the identifying mark on the cartridge case. The Japanese response evolved rapidly. By January 1945, intelligence intercepts showed Japanese units discussing explosive bullets being used by American forces. Japanese propaganda claimed this violated the Hague Convention prohibition on explosive projectiles under 400 grams, a claim technically incorrect, as the convention specified projectiles weighing below 400 grams, designed solely for explosion, whereas the M2HE was a conventional bullet with enhanced fragmentation. More practically, the Japanese adjusted tactics. Night attacks became more dispersed. Charges were abandoned in favor of infiltration. Where possible, Japanese units avoided engaging American positions known to have thunder rifles. This was precisely the psychological effect ComSpec WEPAC wanted. But logistics remained challenging. The red-banded cartridges required careful handling. Dropping a loaded magazine could potentially detonate the primers. The rounds couldn't be stored in temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit due to RDX stability concerns, difficult in the Pacific theater, and barrel wear became significant. Bars firing M2 HE ammunition regularly required barrel replacement after 4,000 rounds instead of the standard 8,000. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, Baker Company's armorer, maintained records showing 14 bar barrel replacements between November 1944 and March 1945, compared to a pre-war average of 3 or 4 per year. The modified ammunition was consuming weapons faster than standard combat use. On February 19, 1945, Marines landed on Iwo Jima. 4 companies carried M2HE ammunition, approximately 3,200 rounds total. The volcanic ash and sand of Iwo Jima proved disastrous for the sensitive ammunition. Feed failures increased. Several rounds detonated in chambers due to overheating from sustained combat. 2 bars were damaged beyond field repair. The Iwo Jima experience prompted a critical assessment. On March 10, 1945, ComSpec WEPAC recommended restricting M2HE use to garrison and defensive positions where environmental conditions could be controlled. Offensive operations in harsh terrain were too unpredictable. This recommendation arrived simultaneously with planning for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945. Estimates projected 500,000 American casualties. The Joint Chiefs were considering every possible advantage. On July 15, 1945, Aberdeen received orders to increase M2HE production to 200,000 rounds per month by October. This would require expansion of manufacturing facilities, recruiting additional workers, and prioritizing manganese bronze allocation. The program was designated Project Thunder and given high priority. Then on August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. Operation Olympic was canceled. Project Thunder was terminated on August 20th, 1945. Total production, 187,400 rounds. The actual mechanism of the M2HE rounds' enhanced effectiveness involved complex terminal ballistics. When the 150-grain projectile struck a target at 2,700 feet per second, it carried 2,427 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The impact deceleration occurred over approximately 8 inches of tissue penetration. Basic physics meant this deceleration triggered the internal RDX charge. The 8 grains of RDX inside the projectile detonated with a velocity of 27,000 feet per second. This is called detonation velocity, different from deflagration, an explosion rather than burning. The energy release was approximately 35 joules, enough to fragment the projectile's copper jacket into 15-20 pieces, weighing 312 grains each. These fragments radiated outward in a roughly spherical pattern, creating a temporary wound cavity, 4.2 times larger than standard M2 ball ammunition. In ballistic gelatin tests, standard rounds created permanent wound cavities measuring 1.2 inches in diameter. M2 HE rounds created cavities measuring 5.1 inches in diameter. The difference in a human body meant significantly increased hydrostatic shock and tissue damage. Against vegetation, the effect was even more pronounced. Jungle combat often meant shooting through banana leaves, vines, bamboo, and light brush. Standard ammunition would lose velocity and potentially tumble after passing through multiple layers. The M2HE round would detonate upon hitting heavy vegetation, clearing a small area and potentially injuring personnel behind cover. Field testing showed a single M2HE round could clear approximately 2.3 square feet of light vegetation, leaves, and vines. Against bamboo, the round would shatter stalks within a 6-inch radius. This made the ammunition particularly effective for breaking up ambushes and engaging targets using natural cover. But the limitations were significant. First, the rounds were temperature sensitive. Below 32 degrees, the RDX could become unstable during firing, causing incomplete detonation. Above 110 degrees, the explosive could degrade or potentially detonate from shock without firing. The Pacific Theater's temperature range was generally suitable, but weapons left in direct sunlight could exceed safe limits. Second, the increased chamber pressure accelerated parts wear beyond just the barrel. The bar's bolt face showed accelerated erosion. The extractor, the small claw that pulled spent cases from the chamber, wore 40% faster. The operating rod that connected the gas piston to the bolt showed stress cracks after approximately 5,000 rounds, mixed standard and M2HE. Third, the ammunition was less accurate. The explosive primer's slightly erratic detonation introduced minor velocity variations. At ranges under 200 yards, this was negligible. At 400 yards, group sizes increased from 4 inches to 7 inches. The bar wasn't designed for precision fire anyway, but the degradation was measurable. Fourth, the sound signature was distinctive. Standard 30 or 6 gunfire produced a sharp crack. M2 HE rounds produced a crack, followed a fraction of a second later by a pop from the detonation. Experienced Japanese soldiers learned to recognize this signature. It became a targeting indicator. If you heard the double sound, that position had a thunder rifle. Marines adapted to these limitations. They learned to store magazines in shade and check ammunition temperature before missions. They learned to clean weapons more frequently and request parts replacements earlier than with standard ammunition. They learned to mix standard and M2HE magazines rather than using exclusively modified ammunition, preserving the special rounds for critical moments. Some Marines didn't like the M2HE rounds. The increased recoil was unpleasant. The accelerated wear meant more maintenance. The occasional feed failure could be fatal in combat. Private First Class David Wong, Baker Company, told his sergeant he preferred standard ammunition because it was more reliable. Others swore by them. Corporal Mitchell, after using M2HE rounds in 23 engagements between November 1944 and March 1945, requested nothing else. His reasoning was simple. They keep the Japs' heads down longer. That's worth cleaning my weapon twice as often. The enemy perspective came primarily from interrogation reports. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, captured on Bougainville in January 1945, described his unit's experience. We could not understand what weapon made such wounds. Men would fall and explode. We thought perhaps grenades, but there was no throw. The Americans fired their rifles, and our men exploded. It affected morale severely. Japanese medical personnel examining their own casualties noted the unusual fragmentation patterns and explosive residue. Several intelligence reports referenced American explosive bullets, but the Japanese never determined the rounds were standard ammunition with modified primers. They assumed it was an entirely new weapon system. This confusion was strategic gold. The Japanese couldn't effectively counter a weapon they didn't understand. On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard USS Missouri. Within weeks, the U.S. military began rapid demobilization. Experimental weapons programs were evaluated for peacetime relevance. Project Thunder didn't make the cut. On October 15, 1945, the War Department ordered all remaining M2HE ammunition recalled to Aberdeen Proving Ground for disposal. Approximately 89,200 rounds remained in inventory. These were destroyed by controlled detonation between October and December 1945. The manufacturing equipment at Aberdeen was dismantled. The technical specifications were classified secret and archived. The ammunition's combat use was similarly classified. Marines who'd used the rounds were ordered not to discuss them. After-action reports mentioning M2HE ammunition were redacted or reclassified. The program disappeared from official history. Several factors drove this decision. First, the Hague Convention concerns, while legally unfounded, presented a public relations problem. The U.S. military had prosecuted German soldiers for using prohibited ammunition. Having used questionable ammunition themselves, even if technically legal, was awkward. Second, the ammunition's limitations made it impractical for peacetime production. The cost per round was 340% higher than standard ammunition. The shelf life was 18 months versus 30 years for standard rounds. The storage requirements were demanding. For a peacetime military focused on cost efficiency, M2HE made no sense. Third, atomic weapons rendered conventional infantry ammunition improvements relatively insignificant. The military's focus shifted to nuclear weapons, guided missiles, and jet aircraft. Small arms development received reduced priority and funding. The classification remained until 1980. The National Archives, processing World War II documents for declassification, discovered Project Thunder files. A review board determined the technical information was no longer sensitive. The Soviet Union had developed similar ammunition decades earlier. On March 12, 1980, Project Thunder was declassified. By then, most participants were dead or elderly. Jimmy Mitchell had left the Marines in 1946, worked as a machinist in Worcester, Massachusetts, and died in 1977. He never told his family about the red banded ammunition. His service records mentioned only that he'd served in the Pacific Theater. The technology itself evolved. Modern explosive ammunition exists in various forms. The Raufoss Mk211 50 caliber round, developed in Norway in the 1980s, uses similar principles: a conventional projectile with an explosive component for enhanced effect. The U.S. military adopted it for use against materiel targets and light armor. High explosive incendiary ammunition for aircraft cannons uses the same basic concept at larger scales. The 20mm rounds fired by the M61 Vulcan cannon contain explosive charges that detonate on impact. The principle Captain Walsh explored in 1944 became standard for air-to-air combat. But no modern equivalent exists for infantry rifles. The technical challenges, pressure management, reliability, cost, remain prohibitive. The M2HE round was a wartime expedient, brilliant in its simplicity, but impractical for widespread use. Its legacy exists primarily in what it demonstrated. That battlefield innovation could emerge from creative application of existing components. Walsh didn't invent new explosives or new weapons. He combined existing elements: Browning's rifle, Springfield's cartridge, the M2 primer, in a novel way that multiplied effectiveness. This approach would resurface repeatedly in military development. The Navy's Phalanx CIWS combined existing radar technology with an existing cannon. The Air Force's JDIM program converted unguided bombs into precision weapons by adding GPS guidance. Innovation through integration rather than invention. The M2HE round also demonstrated the importance of testing weapons in actual combat conditions. Laboratory testing at Aberdeen showed promise. Combat on Bougainville proved effectiveness. Environmental challenges on Iwo Jima revealed limitations. No amount of theoretical testing could replace operational experience. Jimmy Mitchell rotated back to the United States in April 1945. He'd fired approximately 2,400 rounds of M2HE ammunition in combat, roughly 12% of the total ever used. His bar required 3 barrel replacements and numerous parts changes. He never lost a firefight. He received no special decoration for his use of experimental ammunition. That would have required acknowledging the program existed. He got a Purple Heart for a minor shrapnel wound on Bougainville and a Bronze Star for general valor. Standard medals for standard service. After the war, he occasionally wondered about those red-banded rounds, why they'd been issued, where they'd gone, whether other Marines had used them. He asked a few fellow veterans but found no one who'd heard of them. Eventually, he stopped asking. The war receded into memory, classified or not. Captain Theodore Walsh, the Ordnance Corps officer who developed the concept, remained at Aberdeen Proving Ground until his retirement in 1962. His personnel file makes no mention of Project Thunder. After declassification in 1980, a military historian interviewed him. He was 87 years old and remembered the project clearly. "We knew it would work," he said. "The question was whether it would work well enough to justify the complications. In combat, apparently it did. But war ended before we could refine it properly." He died in 1984. Sergeant William Davis, Mitchell's squad leader on Bougainville, made the Marines a career. He retired as a master gunnery sergeant in 1965, having served in Korea and 2 tours in Vietnam. He trained thousands of Marines in infantry tactics. None of them heard about M2HE ammunition because he followed orders and kept it classified. In 1982, after the declassification, a researcher contacted him. He was 64 years old, living in North Carolina. He confirmed the ammunition's effectiveness, but emphasized the weapon wear issues. "Good for emergencies," he said, "not good for daily use. But when the Japs came up that hill, I was damn glad we had them." He died in 1998. The Japanese soldiers who encountered the Thunder rifles left scattered records. Few survived the war. Those who did rarely discussed their combat experiences. Post-war Japan focused on rebuilding, not remembering. One account exists from Sergeant Kenji Takahashi, captured on Bougainville in February 1945, who returned to Japan after the war. In a 1987 interview for a local history project in Yokohama, he mentioned strange American bullets that exploded. He didn't elaborate. The interviewer didn't follow up. The reference exists in an archive, untranslated until 2003. The ammunition itself is gone. All 187 400 rounds, either fired in combat or destroyed after the war. No examples exist in museums or private collections. A few empty cartridge cases might remain in soil on Bougainville or Kaminari-jū, slowly corroding in tropical conditions. What remains is data, reports, statistics, the dry record of weapons tested and battles fought. And beneath that data, lives. Men who carried experimental ammunition into combat, not knowing if it would save them or explode in their faces. Men who pulled triggers and watched enemies torn apart by their own innovation. Men who survived and stayed silent for 35 years because classified meant classified. They were 19, 20, 23 years old. Kids from Massachusetts and North Carolina and California. They were handed yellow-taped magazines and told, "Use these." They did. They survived battles that should have killed them. They came home and never told anyone because orders were orders. This is their story. Finally declassified. Finally told. If this piece of buried history meant something to you, hit that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are hundreds of these stories. Classified weapons, secret operations, forgotten innovations that won battles and saved lives, but never made it into history books. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Did any of your family serve in the Pacific? What other classified World War II weapons do you want to hear about? To Jimmy Mitchell, Theodore Walsh, William Davis, and the 2,400 Marines who carried red-banded ammunition into combat. Your silence kept secrets, but your service kept freedom. We remember. Finally, we remember.